Hi everyone, this is Katie from Moonflower Moments. If you'll bear with me for just a second, you're going to see my hands for just a couple of minutes, and then after that we're going to roll into some pictures that I would like to share with you. So the basic premise of this video is tarot field trip. So I want to share images from a recent trip that I took down to Palmetto State Park, which is a park that's about an hour away from me, and explain the different things that I saw and how they relate to the tarot imagery. So because I was only able to be there for probably about 2 hours, I didn't take a lot of pictures, but I was able to find some ones that really significantly matched the Fool to the Wheel. And so expect a part 2 from this series, but it'll be a different trip. So part of the reason that I want to share this is because I'm very inspired by like Candy Soil and Soul's content. A lot of times like she goes out into the real world and she looks at how tarot matches with the everyday, and I really love the concept of just like finding the magic in the everyday, especially the magic within nature. And so I wanted to do my own version of that, titled Tarot Field Trip, so that I take you with me to one of, I think, the most majestic places on earth. So let's go ahead and get started with it. So the first image that I wanted to share with y'all is the Fool. And so to give you an idea of like what this consists of, so as we were going down the street, we drove for probably about 50 minutes, and all along the side of the road were these beautiful, gorgeous flowers. And I couldn't figure out what they are. I pride myself on knowing native flowers. My husband and I were going back and forth like, are they black-eyed Susans? Are they Coreopsis? What are they? And we finally got to a spot closer to Palmetto State Park where we decided to pull over, and there was just a whole field of these beautiful, now I know they're called clasping coneflowers. And so this image in particular reminded me of the Fool because I was the Fool in that moment, right? Like I had pulled over on a very tiny road. Down here we call them alligator roads because they're so small that like essentially they're used primarily for like alligators to get from one side to the other. So it's just an inside joke. So we had pulled over on this small little alligator road, and there was just this field of flowers, and I'm standing over them and I'm cutting a few of them so that way I can press them. Those will probably be shown in my month gone by videos a little bit later. And there are cars that are passing me, but I'm just standing there in complete amazement, not paying attention to the danger whatsoever, but just paying attention to how beautiful and bright these flowers are. And I think it's pretty incredible that they grow all along the roadside because especially here in the state of Louisiana, unfortunately, a lot of times people spray pesticides and herbicides. You can just see them, like people working for the state, spraying it out of their windows. And so I think it speaks to that resilience and that opportunity to adapt in any situation that the Fool embodies. So now I'm going to get to what really inspired me to make this video, and we're going to come back to this image a little bit later. So we're on to the Magician now. So essentially what I wanted to share with this image is, this is a live oak. And that was my tree for February. So I've spent a lot of time studying live oaks. I have 2 beautiful ones in my backyard that I'm looking at now as we speak. And we happen to see this one. And in its own right, it is an incredible, beautiful live oak. You can see how large it is based off of the trunk. You can see how it's all gnarled and things like that. But the real reason that it reminded me of the Magician is because of this next picture. So let me give you some context about what you're looking at. So essentially what happened is the large mother tree that I had just shown had gotten cut by lightning, and a very large limb severed off of it. And so what you're seeing right here in this image is a very large limb that fell to the ground and took root. So I contacted about 2 different arborists about this that I know of. They're both from the Northeast, but you know, oaks are oaks, so they were able to give me some information. And they told me that they had never seen anything like this in their life, and that this is truly something that's like 1 in a million. And so it reminded me of the Magician, especially because standing there, I was filled with so much power. You know, so this particular tree suffered a lightning strike, which oftentimes I think of the Magician as like a conduit between what's above and below, pulling onto the earth. And I think that lightning is a great example of that energy that's coming from the sky that's being embodied below. So this tree took this energy from this lightning strike, and instead of just crumbling to the ground, this limb took root. And so it really tapped into its inner resources. It looked at the environment around it and it was able to adapt perfectly to this climate. And like I said, this is like 1 in a million chance that this would ever happen. So it's incredibly rare. And so me standing there, I felt the beauty of the magician because it reminded me that in very difficult circumstances, if I look around and I find the tools that I can use and I'm able to take root in the places where I stand, then essentially there is limitless potential. And here's another image of it. So this is, I just wanted a close up because I thought it was really beautiful that it was, you can clearly see from that, all of these things that are offshoots of the tree, that the one that's in, that's closer to you. So all of those offshoots, those weren't there when the limb felt. So, you know, it's not as if it just like took root and is just like stagnant. It took root and it's growing new things. So like I said, I've never seen anything like it. And I think the light in particular in the background gives that aura of that magician because of how bright and beautiful it is. You know, it is limitless possibility. So also with this image, I wanted to share that I believe it is the high priestess. So if you could look in the little, I guess you could say the tear in the limb. Remember, this is the limb that is taken root. You can't see where it's taken root, but this is the one that has taken root. So I think of this as a lot as the high priestess, because if you think about the high priestess, it's someone that has a lot of internal knowledge. So they're not sharing it externally, but they're keeping it close to their heart and keeping it close to their chest, and they're sitting in the knowing and they're sitting in the receiving. And so when I see this image, it instantly brings to mind the high priestess, because I can imagine that, especially with the folds, that I am slipping into the folds of the tree, and I myself am getting to experience that concentration of power from the lightning strike. So I am a believer, like I said, in spirits of place, but I believe that major events can hold an impact on the land and the various things around it. And if you think of the body of this limb, of what it's gone through, not only is it the magician for making the best of its circumstances, but it's the high priestess, especially the inner bark of this limb, for having experienced something that is truly incredible, something that is truly mystical and magical, and knowing that that knowledge lies within the tree. But it's not something that everyday humans can access. It's not as if we can just cut open the tree and see if there's burn marks, because if we were to do that, the tree would be damaged. So it's almost as if that knowledge is being held within this limb and no one can access it other than the tree itself. So now at this point, we've arrived inside of the state park. All of the images that I showed you were ones leading up to it. This is gonna be the Empress. So this is a magnolia tree, which they tend not to be my favorite because I think they're like a little bit too stereotypically associated with the South, but this one really blew me away, so I had to take a picture of it. So as you can see, the limb on the left is starting to extend outward. And I thought to myself, okay, after having contact with the magician, the high priestess, what would someone need, you know, to come through that experience of that immense power? What would someone need? And so they approach the Empress for nurturing, they approach her for caretaking, they approach her for the warmth that I think a mother gives a child. And so if you look at this branch that's extended outward to the left, I really feel like that represents the Empress, because it's a beautiful place for you to curl up with a book. Maybe curl up with like a crossword puzzle, or just like to take a nap. But it's a beautiful place that you can rest, that is completely covered by all of this lush greenery. So the mother essentially has you in her arms and she's there to protect you. Now the next image that I want to share is of the Emperor. So this is a cypress grove at Palmetto State Park, and cypresses primarily grow, they can grow in water and they can also grow on land, but they like areas that are really wet. And so the part of this that I think is the Emperor in particular is the boardwalk. So essentially when you're that close to the Gulf, because we were like 20 minutes away from the Gulf of Mexico, there are a lot of bugs and it is very muddy, and sometimes it's not always the most pleasant experience. Like the nature itself is beautiful, but it rules the area. There isn't a lot of like human civilization, which I think is a beautiful thing, but it can make it more difficult to access. And so I think of this boardwalk that was very carefully crafted as something that represents the emperor, because I want to go within those trees, okay? But with cypress trees, because of the way the roots form knees, so the roots grow like, I'll have to put a picture up. I'll put another picture. It won't be one that I think I do have one that I've taken. Because of the way that they grow these knees, it makes it very difficult to traverse through these bayous, because your canoe or your boat or whatever, like it just can't get through it. It's constantly hitting roots. And so in order for you to be able to access this lush beauty, you have to have the structure and you have to have the discipline of like man-made architecture. But even though the Empress is unbountiful creation, the Emperor has to provide something, some sort of structure for you to be able to access it. So it's essentially that check against that mass growth that allows you the ability to interact with that natural world. So we're gonna go back to the image that I showed you for the magician. So I know this is backtracking a little bit, but I had several images that I could pick for the Hierophant, and I just felt like this one was best. So primarily when we looked at this image before, we had focused on the limb that had fallen down. I want us to take a second and look at the house that's in the background. So this house, upon further inspection, looked to be something that was really run down. It's definitely abandoned. No one's living there. It's just an old abandoned structure. But to me, it filled me with a reverence of the Hierophant, right? Because clearly someone chose to build that house, to build that structure, because of the grove of live oak trees that's around it. And so when I think of the Hierophant, I think it's easy that you can roll into like dogma and religion and things like that, but I prefer a definition of the Hierophant that is a remembrance of tradition and a remembrance of the ancestral lines that came before. That house and that structure is very similar to like the Cajun people or the Acadians and what they would typically live in. And so I think it represents that lineage. And also it represents that close relationship with nature. So there's a reason that Acadiana, where I live, is so beautiful. I believe that the people over here do have a respect for the beauty that's there, especially the live oak trees, and a reverence for it. And so I think that this house, the fact somebody chose to make this dwelling near this grove, represents that close bond to nature that was more prevalent in the past, but is still existing today. And I can honestly see, I would go into that house right now and do a tarot reading. I really would, because it was such a beautiful spiritual place that I think it's a great example of like a human structure, which I feel like the Hierophant in that way is more of like a human connection to the divine rather than like the spiritual connection of the magician. So it's a human structure that would allow you to look out the window and pause and see the beauty and the reverence around you, which, if you ask me, is my form of spirituality. So we're going to jump back to the swamp a little bit. So next to the boardwalk, I saw these two trees, and even before I decided to make this video, I took a picture of it because I was like, wow, this is definitely the lovers. So one of my favorite representations of the lovers is when two trees come together and their roots bind together. I think it is a beautiful representation. And here we have two bald cypress trees, and you can see that their roots are starting to combine together. Okay, so even though they're definitely in standing water, which is one of the places that they like to live. This water is like very mucky. The water shifts a lot, meaning that the mud shifts a lot. So it's not exactly like the most stable of the soils, which is the reason that bald cypresses, primarily their roots go straight down, right? They go straight down. But when they go straight down, they also interlock with other trees to form these groves. And so I believe that represents the lovers, because I mean, one, you have two trees that are sitting so close to each other. So without a doubt, because they've grown up together in the same environment, they are intrinsically linked, they are interwoven, they are together, and they cannot be separated. So I have two cypress trees that are right outside my window here at my house, and I would never cut down one in fear of damaging the other. I think that the way the roots grow, you have to have one or you have to have the other, and I think that represents you have to have both. I think that represents the deep commitment of the lovers, because it's almost as if when you're making that lifelong connection, when you're making that choice to be that connected and committed with someone, you are putting your life interwoven with theirs and cannot be separated from any circumstance. You also have this log that's trying to keep them apart, but I think it's beautiful that even though there's a log trying to keep them apart on the surface, they're reaching underneath to hold each other. So the superficial things on the surface don't matter. The connection is that deep that it traverses all. So the next image I wanted to share is of the chariot. So I can identify a couple trees that are in this. I believe that you have to the left like a magnolia tree because of those brown leaves. It looks like on the right, those light green leaves, that's either, I'm not sure what that one is. Yeah, I can't even say it's either. I'm not sure what that one is. But the back one, the tree that's in the middle, is a water oak. I do know that for sure. So you have a canopy of probably about 5 to 6 different trees here. And it reminded me of the chariot because all of these trees, when I've seen them in other places, they tend to grow like short and stout. But in this particular forest, which was right next to the cypress grove, they were all growing upwards. And so I think that's a beautiful representation of the momentum and also the direction of the chariot. When you've reached that point in your life when you are the chariot, the charioteer, you are moving with that momentum towards the sky no matter what. And so even though they're hitting obstacles such as other trees, they still have that innate resilience to tap into their skills, to tap into that determination, and to just grow upward so that they're able to compete for those light resources. So we're heading back to the grove right here, the cypress grove. You can see in the very background that there's a tree that has fallen. I couldn't get into there. I mean, I obviously needed more of the Emperor boardwalk, but I couldn't get back there all the way to show you a better picture of this. But essentially that tree is still growing. So even though it is completely fallen sideways, the leaves on it are still lush and they're still green. And so I think this is a great example of strength, okay? Like I had said before, it's very rare for a cypress tree to fall because even though the water is shifting and the mud is shifting, they deep root so intensely that that's just not something that you see is a cypress tree that falls over. So I think in particular for this tree, I can personify it a little bit because, you know, it's a tree that has been raised with this expectation that I am strong, I am resilient, I am able to do all. And then all of a sudden, you know, a storm comes or some situation happens and it falls over. But instead of letting it hold it back, it's almost as if it took those lessons from that chariot and it's continuing on, okay? And then I also wanted to mention too, so right now it's swarmer season in South Louisiana. I better give more context to that because it makes sense for if you're here, but it doesn't if you're not. So Louisiana has a lot of termites. It's just part of what it is. So between like April and then July, massive termite swarms come from the hive or come from the nest and try to find other places to establish a colony and to eat the wood. And so when I think of the cypress, I also think of its innate resilience. It's one of the best trees to build houses out of, or structures out of, because it's very innately termite resistant. So even though you have all of this natural world around it, I did see a lot of termites on this property that were eating like dead wood. That tree itself is not dead. It could be dead because of the way that it's fallen, but it's not dead. It's still photosynthesizing. It's still doing what it needs to be doing to be a tree. And then if a termite did happen to crawl within the bark of it, it probably would repel it immediately. So it reminds me of that courage, that balance between that nature and then also like your innate strength of trying to find that place, which is a good place to be. So that is strength. All right, next we're going to move on to hermit. So I have a couple of images for hermit. So I know that I had mentioned that we had gone to Palmetto State Park. I did want to show you this image because of these are right here in the middle. You can see the two things that are like sticking up like fans. Those are palmettos. And palmettos can get much bigger than that, but those are typically their usual size. So I think a lot of this image when I think of the hermit, because right outside of this area, someone had built a classroom so that teachers could bring their students to learn. And it had like benches and it had like all of these different kinds of like wood cuttings built into the trees so the students can like learn and interact with nature. And so that reminded me a lot of the hermit. I know that that could also be used for Hierophant, but just give me a second, I'll explain why. So I think that it would be unrealistic to bring your kids to this area. So being that I am a teacher myself, like I would not bring kids to an area that had a lot of mosquitoes because all you would hear is crying all the day. However, I would myself use that area that's full of benches for my own meditation. The way that the sun is streaming down upon these palmettos really does remind me a lot of the hermit, because essentially what's happening is that the hermit is receiving the sunlight. So it is becoming enlightened because of this isolated stretch. So even though the property was meant to be used as like a classroom and a gathering space, I don't think that everyone would go into it. I think that only someone who was seeking solace and seeking independent solace would go into it. And I highly doubt that someone would ever like stumble across you, because like I said, the mosquitoes were so terrible that it was really difficult for even me, and I'm not a complainer, to get through it. So it represents that introspection of the hermit, going to places that no others would go so that you can go within. I have another image of the hermit here, and this one is similar to the high priestess like I had said, but because of the moth that's in the middle, I'm going to explain why it's different from the crevices of the tree that I had described before. So what I saw when I took this picture is I primarily was looking at the tree bark because I really liked these beautiful colors. I think it is just a gorgeous array of like browns and reds, which are some of my favorite colors. And then I happened to see the moth, and I thought to myself when I took this picture, wow, imagine being a moth that could go inside of the tree like that. Like you probably wouldn't want to because there's probably lizards and other kind of dangers, but like hypothetically you could go within the barks of that crevice. So this moth has the ability to go within something, to be cocooned by that knowledge, to be cocooned by that introspection, to seek that solace and that shelter, and to really take the time to come within themselves that other creatures cannot due to their size. Okay, and finally we're at the wheel. So like I said, I had to stop here because I didn't have enough pictures, but we'll definitely have a part 2. So the wheel is, oftentimes when I think of the wheel, I think of the interposition between fate and free will. And I think that ultimately what I've decided with like the fate versus free will discussion is that you have to make the best of the circumstances that you're in. And so I wanted to share this beautiful imagery of these trees because these are the ones that are right behind the branch that had taken root. So essentially when I look towards this image, I think to myself of like making what you can of life. So if you can see, this is a pretty crowded grove for live oaks. They're supposed to be spaced out like at least 50 feet apart. So the fact you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 within that 50 feet, there's a lot of competition. And so instead of just succumbing to the circumstances in which these trees were bred, what they decided to do is start to move to the left. As you can see, especially the tree, one of the trees on the left is like completely making a turn towards the sun so that they're able to compete for resources. And so I think that reminds me a lot of the wheel because, you know, even though this grove has gone through a lot of like lightning strikes, even though it is very old, so it's succumbed to like a changing climate with like temperatures getting hotter and things like that, it is able to make the best of what it has. And that's always what I think about when it comes to the wheel. Change is gonna happen, right? But what are you doing to ensure that you're mitigating that change, that you're surviving that change, that you're thriving in that change? That is always what I think of. Not the fact that it's gonna happen, but what are you gonna do about it? And I think that these oaks represent a great example of that because they have that flexibility. Just like I had showed earlier with the strength card of the tree that had fallen down. That is very similar in itself. And I think that touches on some of the things that nature can teach us overall of resilience and just knowing how to make the best of life. So thank you so much for watching this video. It is, I'm trying to figure out exactly like technologically how to do this best. Because it is like a little far out of my skill set, but I figured that I would tap into the Fool and just try something new. And so I really appreciate y'all being here. If you like this content, please subscribe because I will have more content just like this. Thank you so much for all the support that y'all give my channel, and I hope that y'all have a beautiful day. Thank you.